So let's talk about chapter 21 and but not just 21. Let's talk about the final three chapters of this course in general, chapter 21, 22, and 23. And as I have already told you guys in my Facebook posts, is that there's really nothing new left for us to learn in this course. Okay, so everything that we have learned in 207 and 209, uh, that's it effectively. Okay, so to sum up, we started 207. We started this book with a discussion on the goods market and the financial market. And from that, we got the ISLM uh, model. That was short run. Then we moved on to medium run, where we allowed price and unemployment levels to vary. And that gave us the Phillips curve. And once we combined the short and the medium run, we got the ISLM-PC model. Then we took a look at the long run, in which technology and capital stock was allowed to vary. And from there, we took a look at the solo growth model. That was in 207. Then we came to 209 and we looked at, we started off with expectation. So agents were making their decisions based on the economic conditions of just one period, the current period, in all previous chapters. But starting from chapter 14, what the agent started to do was make expectations, make predictions, or let's say make forecasts about what they expected to happen in the economy. We had already taken a look at expectation in chapter 8 and 9 when we looked at the Phillips curve, where we had expectation of inflation and expected inflation. In chapter 14, 15, 16, we just pushed it a bit forward and there was suddenly expectations about everything, let's say. Then the next four chapters were about openness. So until chapter, what was it? Before chapter 17, we had assumed a closed economy, an autarkic economy that was effectively just producing whatever it was consuming. But then once we opened up the economy, countries became able to trade with each other. But that also made it possible for us to not just focus on the goods market, the domestic goods market, but also the international goods market, not only the domestic financial market, but also the international financial market. And then we had to start worrying about international interest rates and the exchange rate and all those things. And that's as far as we had done. And that's all we need to know. Okay. So in chapter 21 to 23, what we are going to do is discuss the implications of what we already know. Okay. So first of all, what I want you guys to is when you see things like this, let's just ignore this, okay? We are obviously using a book written by Olivier Blanchard. Blanchard is American, and more importantly, the American economy tends to have a strong impact on the economies around the world. So most economic books tend to focus on America. So when we are talking about policymakers, it makes sense if we are talking about the goods market and we take a look at the goods market in America. Okay, it's different from what's happening in Bangladesh, but there are still some similarities that are transferable. But when we are talking about policies and policymakers, what's happening in America really isn't that important for us in Bangladesh. So we will still have to talk about the American economy, but we are sort of going to be ignoring, what their Congress is doing and the Senate is doing and all their legislations and rules and all. So let's just ignore all of that. Okay. Effectively, in this chapter, what we are going to do are two things. Okay. Number one is we are going to try and discuss that all the tools that we have learned about so far in these two courses. And what we are trying to say is that whenever there is a macroeconomic problem, if we properly implement these policies, or if we properly use these tools, that problem can be taken care of. But then the first question that we are going to ask is, the people who will decide which policy to implement, do they know what the right decision is? And why might they not know what the right decision is? Because of two things. One is because of uncertainty. We don't know everything. We only know a few things. And the second is because of expectations. Okay, so how might expectations impact? Actually, we'll come to this one by one. So because of these two things, the question is, number one, do the policymakers know exactly what the right decision is, or exactly, given the problems that we're facing, is it the correct policy to implement? And then the second thing, a bit more contentious, a bit more, controversial perhaps, is we're going to ask, do policymakers want to make the right decision? In very simple terms, if you want to be overtly controversial, you might go and say politicians don't care about us. All they care about is themselves. And so they will make decisions that benefits themselves, and not us. If you want to be a bit more diplomatic, you may ask question is that there are two political parties, right? In this book, of course, that focuses on USA, they're going to focus on Republicans and Democrats. If we were taking a look at Europe, let's say in UK, for example, the two major parties are, of course, the Conservatives and the Labour, but there are also other smaller parties that are very important. Somewhere in Germany, you would be talking about 5 or 6 different parties. In Bangladesh, we have Awami League and BNP, with, of course, other small parties. And in recent years, of course, Awami League have had pretty strong influence on policymaking. Okay, but ultimately what that means is that unless even if you know what the right decision is, unless you have complete control to decide exactly which policy to implement, what you are often doing is you're negotiating with other political parties who have different agendas. Or even if you guys have the same agendas, maybe you guys think the same goals can be achieved in 2 different ways. So you're always negotiating, you're always trying to come out on top of the other parties. And in this scenario, do you even have any motivation to make the absolute right decision, or are you just trying to win, make a better decision than the other party would? I mean, we are going to talk about all of that. So let's start with uncertainty, which was the first thing that I highlighted here. Sorry, right here, uncertainty. So we are talking about, do policymakers know what the right decision is? And for that, what we need to acknowledge just how little we know, okay, about the economy. So I've written down some of these things, okay, over here. So in Eco 102, you guys probably did that in your 2nd or 3rd semester. It's been a while ago. You guys learned about something called a potential GDP, right? We refer it as YN now, which is the natural rate of output. That's effectively potential GDP. Okay, so now it's possible for us to calculate our GDP. It may not be 100% accurate, but we can calculate how much goods and services have been produced in the year and what's the monetary value of these goods and services. And then we can calculate Y. Possible, theoretically. How do we figure out what our potential GDP is? This is a purely abstract concept. It's a calculation that we do to say that this is probably how much we can produce. And in the long run, it will be stable. We can be producing this level. But is there any way with any level of certainty figuring out what our potential GDP is? Not really. There isn't. That's number one. Let's take a look at number two. How do we calculate inflation? By constructing a basket of goods. A basket of goods. And of course, hopefully you all remember how we decide what goes in the basket of goods. But how do we know with any level of certainty that the price index that we are calculating is valid? How do we know that we are using a valid basket of goods and that some goods in it shouldn't be there and some goods that are not there should be there? There's really no way of figuring that out. It's just us deciding what's most likely to be the basket of goods. There is no mathematical formula that tells us exactly what the composition of a basket of goods should be, right? And that's the uncertainty that we're trying to talk about, is that when we talk about theory, we know everything. It's theory. But in reality, we do not know a whole lot. In fact, we don't know much more than what we know. So this is a nice thing that I've underlined, is that those who know little should do little. And in this case, we are talking about policymakers, okay? If they don't know a lot. So the question is, of course, that's the name of the chapter, is that, what's happening? Sorry. Should policymakers be restrained? If you don't know a whole lot, should we trust policymakers to make big decisions, or should we want them to act as little as possible, only act when they absolutely must? So there are some interesting examples given in the book, okay? So here, this is an important section. Let's read this carefully. Is that how much do we really know? Okay, how can we possibly know? And so let's just go through the highlighted parts. So suppose what the central bank is doing is they're planning on lowering the interest rate, which is effectively an expansionary monetary policy. If they do this, the idea is that I will go down. As a result, Y will go up. And when economic activities go up, unemployment will fall. Okay, that's the plan. But there are so many things to think about, right? Okay, the first concern, what we learned about chapter 7 is the natural rate of unemployment. Now, do we know if the economy is in the natural rate of unemployment? As we already talked about, there is no way for us to know with any certainty what our natural rate is. And so we cannot tell if the economy is producing as potential, less than potential, or more than potential. So that's the first problem. Second problem, we do not know if our output, even if it's not at the natural rate, we do not know if it's very close to the natural rate or very far away from the natural rate. And so if we are very far away from our natural rate of unemployment or natural rate of output or whatever it may be, then but we think we're close, then we may implement a policy that's not strong enough, and so it doesn't end up doing enough for the economy. Or it may be the case that we are very close to the natural rate, but we mistakenly think that we're very far away. So we implement a very strong policy that actually takes us to the other side. We now overshoot the natural rate. And so we were trying to lower unemployment. We implement a stronger than necessary expansionary monetary policy. And so what happens? Think of ISLM-PC curve. What we have actually done now is caused inflation. So see, we cannot be sure. And then we've learned this first 2 points, this were from 207. So if we look at what we've done in 209, like if I is going to go down, stock prices will change. So the question is, of course, stock price will go up, but the question is by how much? The question is how long will it take? Will this change, rise in stock price, be instantaneous, or will it rise over time? If I is going down, we know that E will also go down. So once again, the question is by how much, and what will be the transition mechanism? We don't know any of that. And then, of course, the J curve that we had talked about is that this thing that's going to play out, fall in I leading to fall in E, this isn't going to happen immediately, which means that in the short run, while that transmission period is playing out, our net export is going to be suffering. And we do not know exactly how long the J-curve effect will take. Or maybe we know, but we don't know with absolute certainty. We just have an estimate. So you see that we've talked about expansionary monetary so many times in this course. We've always said, all right, okay, so economy is facing this problem. Let's say Y is less than YN. So let's just implement expansionary monetary policy, and that will take care of the problem. But now what we're starting to see is that it's not that easy. It's easy, it's very easy in theory. It's not that easy in real life. There's an interesting thing here, okay? So read this section. I'm not going through it right now, but read this section, go through this diagram, and you see just how difficult it is for us to actually predict what's going to happen in the economy with any given certainty. So ultimately, then that brings us to the question that this chapter deals with, is that should this uncertainty lead policymakers to do less? And over here, it deals with how like small miscalculations may lead policymakers into making huge, mistakes. So as I said, read this section. This part is just a continuation of that. Okay, so read this as well. This just shows that because we don't know exactly what's going to happen, so over here we have 10 different predictors of the same thing, but you see they all give us different results. For example, in year one, this prediction is saying will be here, but this prediction is saying will be here. At year two, this is saying will be here, this is saying will be here. There's this huge discrepancy in what's going on. And so there's just a bit of numerical calculation shown here, is that how these discrepancies can lead to a completely different outcome of what we are talking about. Okay, so I'm not going through the calculations, you guys can do it yourselves, but effectively just try to understand the rationale. So this is ultimately an important thing. In fact, higher unemployment, okay, no, it's fine. So what this area is saying, that we should, policymakers, actually not we, policymakers should only act when there are some big problems in the economy, is that we want to avoid large prolonged recession. If we have a small recession, maybe it's a good idea for policymakers not to get involved, because if they do, they may make the situation worse than it is. Only if it looks like the recession is going to be long-term and pretty bad, maybe only then policymakers should get involved, slowing down booms, okay, because if we have large prolonged booms, that will create inflation. And then they're right there, inflationary pressure. So effectively, what we want is policymakers to be a bit more careful. And actually, this is what I was looking for. Macroeconomic policies should stop well short of fine-tuning. What does that mean? Suppose what we want is an unemployment of 2%. Okay, for example, suppose what we have in reality, let's call it y star equals 2.2%. Policymakers, what we are trying to say in this chapter, in this subsection, is that policymakers should not fine-tune. If we have 2.2, okay, it's not what we wanted, but we should just accept it. If we try to fix this and reduce unemployment by 0.2%, how do you do that? We just saw that example right here, right? We talked about that. We wanted to lower unemployment, so we wanted to implement an expansionary monetary policy. But see, there are all there are all these things that we don't know. And then effectively, if we try in presence of all this uncertainty, if we still try to implement a policy, what we might end up with, it's right here. See, so hopefully you guys will read this, but I'm just highlighting the important bit right here. The unemployment rate a year hence could be anywhere between 1.7 and 6.75%. I mean, of course, there's the calculation over here, but see, that's a huge difference, right? As a policymaker, you're trying to fix the economy, but the policy that you're implementing can ensure that your unemployment rate is anywhere between 1.76% and 6.75%. That's a huge range. And this isn't even the worst case scenario. Remember, we're talking about the United States of America, the country with the best models, the best economists, the most carefully collected data. Despite all that benefits, they're facing a scenario such as this. So just imagine what will happen in a place like Bangladesh. Okay, that's why what we are saying is that do not fine-tune, do not fine-tune. If it's not exactly what you wanted, just let it be. We want general, like let's say we want inflation somewhere between 2 to 4%, okay? Or that's unemployment. Let's stay with the same example. So we want it between 2 to 4%. Now, if unemployment is 5%, okay, then maybe we try to reduce it. We try to bring it back to 4. And even if the effect is very strong, and instead of 1% reduction, there's a 3% reduction, we still end up in 2. Okay, we are still where we want to be, for example. But if we're at 2.2, there's no need for us to go to exact 2%. It's probably not going to work out. Okay, so that was about uncertainty, right? Let me just double check. Yeah, that was about uncertainty. Now let's talk about expectation. Uncertainty makes sense to all of you, I'm sure, but you might be expecting, how might expectation make policymakers' job difficult? For that, okay, so here's another note I've added for you guys. I'm sure you guys have heard the term game theory. Probably in Eco 206 or Eco 208. If you haven't, just Google the prisoner's dilemma, okay? And I mean, that's a pretty nice example. Effectively, what game theory is that when you make a decision, you don't make a decision in isolation. You don't say, I want X to happen, therefore I will do this. When there is expectation in the mix, what you also do is, I want X to happen. I know that this and person or the government or these companies are probably going to do these things. As a result, what should I do? Okay, you are no longer making your decision in isolation. You're taking all possible actions by other people into account before deciding what you should do. And that makes policy difficult. So, staying with the same example, government was trying to implement an expansionary monetary policy to lower the unemployment scenario. Okay, that's good. But now, if there is expectation and if people already expect the government to do this, we've talked about this in chapter 14, 15, and 16, right? If people expect the government to implement an expansionary monetary policy, the effect of this monetary policy will be smaller, because or even non-existent. There won't be any effect. Remember that midterm question that I asked you guys is that the Central Bank of USA lowered interest rates and nothing happened to the stock market. And then 1 month later, when they lowered the interest rate once again, the stock market rose. Why? Because the first case, the change was expected, that the interest rate will be lowered. And in the second case, the change was not expected. So this is effectively game theory, right? People, before they make their consumption decision, their investment decision, any decision, people and businesses and companies, they're always trying to predict what the government will do. And if you can predict correctly, that means, you act that way, which may at times weaken the effect of policies. And this is not a bad thing. Like when I'm trying to decide how much I should save, of course, what I'm also trying to do is I'm trying to predict what might the interest be next year? What might my tax rates be next year? How might the economy do next year? We all do this. But once we start to do this, it makes the government's job difficult. Okay, sorry about that. So that's effectively here. I've already highlighted the important part. The economy is composed of people and firms who try to anticipate what policymakers will do and who react not only to current policy, but also expected future policies. That's what makes it difficult. If you guys are interested in game theory, if you read about Prisoner's Dilemma and find it interesting, take a look at A Beautiful Mind. If you haven't, it's a pretty good movie on the life of John Nash. He was effectively the pioneer of game theory. Of course, the movie doesn't deal with, that theory and economics and all of that, but it's an entertaining movie nonetheless. Read this if you want to. It's fun. But effectively, let's come here. Now, this is interesting. This is the problem that policymakers may face when people are trying to anticipate what they will be doing. So we start off with this Phillips curve. You all should know this from chapter 8 and 9. Okay. And so for the sake of simplicity, no, not this. Sorry. Where is it? So here. So the Federal Reserve, the Central Bank of USA, says that they will follow a monetary policy of what they want is zero inflation. Okay. If they want zero inflation, effectively, what that means is that people believe this announcement. So because the Feds want zero inflation, wage rates won't be going up and all of that. So effectively what we end up with is a scenario where this is equal to zero. Okay, because this is what the Feds are going after. Expected inflation is zero. So this is what we end up with. And hopefully you all remember this from 207. If not, you may have to go and revise a little bit. Okay, but here's the interesting part. Okay. Let me underline this. So what we know from data is that alpha is roughly 0.5. Okay, this is for USA. For Bangladesh, it will be a different figure, but it doesn't really matter right now. So alpha is 0.5. So what the Feds realize is that by accepting 1% inflation, so sorry. Okay. So if inflation, this right here, if they accept 1% inflation, what they can do is they can decrease unemployment by 2%. Okay, so Feds have told everyone that their target is going to be 0% inflation. As a result, because people have trusted the Feds, we ended up in this situation. But now Feds realize that by increasing just 1% inflation, they can reduce unemployment by 2%. And of course, the Feds can make that happen, right? They can implement a policy where the economy, by fixing the interest rate, they can go to a point where there is 1% inflation in the economy. But what's the problem here? The problem is that people might anticipate this. That's what we are focusing on in this subsection, anticipation or expectation. Once the people expect that this might happen, what happens is that the workers now expect 1% inflation. So they are going to demand higher wage. When they demand a higher wage, inflation on its own is going to go up to 1%, right? Once that goes up, see, the people have already anticipated this. Inflation has already gone up to 1% now. It was going to be 0%. It is 1% now, but unemployment has not gone down. Try to figure out the problem. Inflation was going to be 0%, and unemployment was going to be 2%. Okay. Now, what the Feds realized is that if they accepted a 1% inflation, they could lower unemployment from this level. And they were going to do this. But because the people have already anticipated that there will be 1% inflation, they demand higher wages. When wages go up, prices go up. So inflation already takes place of that 1%. This is done. But this was not done by the Feds lowering the interest rate, right? The Feds have not done anything. If they had, they could have lowered unemployment, but they have not. So the problem, see that we are experiencing the inflation, but in this case, unemployment is not going down. If people had not anticipated this move, then the Feds could have accepted this 1% inflation for a lower, maybe 1% unemployment. That has not happened. So you see, anticipation, expectation ruins this plan of the Feds, and this may continue. Next, we now already have 1% inflation. So if next year, if the Feds want to lower unemployment, they might be thinking, we will accept 2% inflation. Okay. They're trying to do this on their own. But once again, if people anticipate this to happen, they're going to demand a higher wage, even without the Feds doing anything. Inflation is going to go up, but unemployment is going to remain at the same level. So Feds can't do anything about this. So that's the problem with anticipation or expectation. So this is an important section. Give it a go. Oh, and an important thing that I've written down here is, of course, see the opinions that we're talking about, what the policymakers should do and what they shouldn't do and all that. These are expressed in this book. These are Olivier Blanchard's opinions. You may disagree with them. In fact, I disagree with Blanchard in a few places. A lot of people disagree with Olivier Blanchard. It's perfectly fine if you don't like the arguments that are being made, but always make sure that you don't just say, I don't like this argument or this argument is wrong. As an economist, what you should be doing, or at least should be trying to do when you don't like an opinion, is offer an alternative point of view. Okay, so in this section, what Olivier Blanchard is saying, of course, in the first case, our position was that policymakers should not fine-tune. That was the first thing. The second thing we're going to say is policymakers need consistency. Okay. By that, what I mean is that once the central bank, let me just go up here, once the central bank said that they are going to target 0% inflation, they should really stick to 0% inflation. Of course, it looks like by accepting a small level of inflation, they can lower unemployment, and that may look like a good thing. But the problem with doing that is that people are not dumb. People are going to anticipate this move. People are going to act on their own. And what that's going to do, in this specific example, unemployment rate stays the same, but inflation goes up. If the Feds had actually, once they promised zero inflation, if they had actually pursued zero inflation, then none of this would have happened. So the second thing that Blanchard is saying is that policymakers should be consistent. And once you make a statement that we are going to pursue X, Y, and Z, even if a better alternative becomes possible, at times, it may be a good idea to just stick to your plans. What that does is establishing credibility. People have faith in you. Okay, and of course, the next thing that we are going to talk about is politics and policies. So remember, the second thing that we were going to talk about in this chapter is that do policy makers want to make the right decision? And you guys may have heard, I don't know, there's something called the principal agent problem. So I don't know if you guys have heard about it. It's if you have done some finance course or business course, I'm sure you've heard of it. What this usually is that for any company, there are always the owners and the managers. Now, what the owners want is the company to be successful in the long run. You want the company to give you a steady amount of profit for a period of time. But owners are not running the company, right? The company is run by the managers. What the managers want is short-term profit. Because managers' contracts are usually linked with performance. They say, like, if the company does well this year, you get a bonus. If it doesn't, you don't get a bonus, let's say. So if there is a decision to be made that like this year we can increase our profit by 10%, or we can make an investment which reduces our profit right now by 20%, but 5 years later will give us a 50% higher profit. The owner will obviously want the second one, right? They will take a 20% loss this year for a 50% return next year. The manager might be thinking, I might not even be with this company in the long run in 5 years' time. I'd rather take the thing that the option that gives me 10% more profit this year, which means I get my bonus, and that way I make more money. So that's called the principal agent problem. And we have the same problem with policymakers, or let's say politicians, is that politicians are always trying to get your vote, right? And the way to get your vote might be to promise low tax. We all love low tax. So when politicians promise to cut your tax, we love it. When politicians promise to, give us anything, any amenities, any financial benefit, we love it. But that may not necessarily be the best thing for the country. But politicians are always, always pandering to the people. They have to get the votes. So this is effectively what I was talking about in the principal agent problem, is that many macroeconomic policy decisions involve trading off short-run loss against long-run gains. And so can we rely on politicians to make these difficult decisions? Politicians are always afraid that a short-run loss might mean that they don't win the next election. And then the next person who is elected actually enjoys the long-run gain, which wasn't his decision in the first place, but he's in office, he gets all the credit. And so that's something that's always stopping politicians from making, long-run decisions. This is an interesting diagram of US. So this shows the government debt. So effectively, we've talked about fiscal policy. Expansionary fiscal policy means what? Either G is going up or T is going down. Of course, when that happens, government debt increases, right? So what you see is that whenever there is a large rise in debt, this has always been for a reason. This was because of World War I, where before going to war, the government saved up some money. This was the Great Depression. This was World War II. This all made sense. But since, let's say, 1980, look at what's happened to US government debt. This was around this level. Look at where it is. It was in 2014. So by 2020, we're probably up here. So see, it's gone up by this much. Something like this. I've made a mess, and I don't think I've made things any clearer. So the question is, this rise in government debt made sense. This rise made sense. This rise made sense. But what's up with this rise? Why is this happening? This is effectively because of this thing, what we talked about, is that voters love it when taxes go down. Voters love it when governments spend money. And so when you're focusing on the short run, all government, whether you are Democrat or Republican, since we're talking about US, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, you want this to happen. But if you keep doing it over and over again, your debt is going to, it's going to keep going up. That's what we're seeing here. So there's an interesting discussion here about political business cycle. We have talked about business cycle before. Probably not in 2009, in 2007. So there's something called a political business cycle. In US, for example, presidents are elected for 4 years. So you would see that uh, government debt goes up leading up to an election, because that's when all politicians are pandering, they're lowering taxes, they're increasing government expenditure. Right after the election, you will see that this trend might reverse, at least for a small period of time. So it's an interesting discussion here. Take a look. Here's another important discussion here, is that, so they're talking about the deficit once again. So when does the deficit go up? Either when taxes are going down or when government expenditure is going up. Now, both parties, we're talking about US, so both Democrats and the Republicans may want to reduce the deficit, but they may have very different ideas about how to do this. The Democrats might say that we should increase tax, and that will solve the problem. The Republicans might say we just need to reduce our spending, and that will solve the problem. So they're both trying to achieve the same thing, but they have different ideas about what to do. And what this leads to is, a jam. I mean, you can't move anywhere. They just keep arguing, and even if a decision is made about this and this, or a compromise between both of this, it takes time. It takes longer than it should. And during that time, the economy continues to suffer. This is known as war of attrition. Read about this if you are interested in game theory. It's pretty interesting. This is another interesting. If you are only interested in US politics, then you might find this interesting, okay? But if you're not, then you don't really need to read it. But if you are interested in US politics, read this section and take a look at table 21.1. It's very interesting. So effectively the same thing. We're talking about the restrained. But this is this is quite specific to USA, so you don't need to read this. So effectively, to summing up what we have talked about in this chapter, first of all, effect of macroeconomic policies are always uncertain. Because it's uncertain, policymakers should be extra careful. Second of all, what we talked about game theory. So this is not a machine. The economy is not a machine. There is no guarantee that if I do X, Y will always happen. If you do X, people are always trying to predict that you will do X and react to that. So this is not a machine, and you have to keep that in mind as well. Second of all, when you're playing a game, we're going back to game theory, it's always good to give up some of your options. So the example that we talked about, when the central bank initially promises to have a 0% inflation, but then they decide that by accepting 1% inflation, I can reduce unemployment, so let's do that. It's probably better that once you make a policy announcement, stick to it. If you don't, you lose your credibility. Let's give it right here. You lose your credibility, and when you lose your credibility, people are, then you're not, you're stuck in a place where none of your policies are as effective as they could have been. And of course, this is what we talked about very recently, is that politicians are probably looking at the short run and not at the long run. So that's another problem that we have. Okay, so effectively that's it. I mean, if I were to sum up this was a chapter on should policymakers be restrained. So first thing is no. Policymakers should not be restrained, but policies should be restrained. So what I mean by that is that policymakers should have the freedom to decide and implement a policy that they think will be the best for the economy. What we want is for the policymakers to understand and accept their own limitations because of uncertainty and expectation and all of that. And so be careful with the policies that they implement. So we've talked about this in detail. First thing is do not fine tune. You're probably not going to get the perfect outcome for any policies that you implement, but that's fine. Just let it be. Second of all, be consistent. Because you want your policies to be attuned to the expectation. When you start moving things around, outcomes go haywire. Third thing, what was the third thing? What was the third thing? Approach policymaking as a game. I don't mean a sports game. I mean as in the game theory sense, is that you're not making decisions in isolation. You're making decisions while taking into account what other people will be doing. So effectively, this is it for this chapter. Effectively, what we've tried to show is that there are considerable uncertainties about policies. Theory is easy, implementation is difficult. And as a result, these things must be kept in mind. So that's it for this chapter. And I will upload a similar video for chapter 22, 23. But as I've said already to all of you, more than these videos, what's more important right now are discussions. So hopefully I'll see you guys during the live sessions with some questions and some topics to talk about. That will be far more useful than this long video that I've made.